Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back to help explore some more ideologies. Today we are diving back into the works of Bertrand Russell. This is In Praise of Idleness. We are on chapter 2, Useless Knowledge. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everyone, but some people seem to find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above in the box down below, along with the original source material so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. A particular note today is almost certainly going to be exploring ideologies, where we are talking about exactly why communism is stupid. With that being said, let us dive in and continue our exploration of Bertrand Russell's In Praise of Idleness with Useless Knowledge. Francis Bacon, a man who rose to eminence by betraying his friends. I do not know that that's a fact. I don't think that that's a fact, but I do not expect much factual information from Bertrand Russell. Asserted, no doubt as one of the ripe lessons of experience, that knowledge is power, but this is not true of all knowledge. Sir Thomas Browne wished to know what song the sirens sang, but if he had ascertained this, it would not have enabled him to rise from being a magistrate to being high sheriff in his country. The sort of knowledge that Bacon had in mind was that which we call scientific. In emphasizing the importance of science, he was belatedly carrying on the tradition of the Arabs in the early Middle Ages, according to which knowledge consisted mainly of astrology, alchemy, and pharmacology. Yeah, you're severely lacking in your knowledge there, Mr. Russell, all of which were branches of science. A learned man was one who, having mastered these studies, had acquired magical powers. In the early 11th, if you don't know, if you are unaware, if you are only here because of the ideologies, I deal with magic. I deal with, I'm going to be dealing with alchemy, and that is coming, but I deal with manipulations of the electromagnetic foundational harmonics of the universe, which is the Holy Spirit. I have healed myself with that. So a learned man was one who, having mastered these studies, had acquired magical powers is not true, but it can be. In the early 11th century, Pope Sylvester II, for no reason except that he read books, was universally believed to be a magician in league with the devil. Prospero, and now I'm going to go ahead and say this now, anybody that says you are in league with the devil is ignorant. They have no idea even of their own beliefs. Prospero, who in Shakespeare's time was a mere fantasy, represented what had been for centuries the generally received conception of a learned man, so far at least as his powers of sorcery were concerned. Bacon believed, rightly, as we now know, that science could provide a more powerful magician's wand than any that had been dreamed of by the necromancers of former ages. The Renaissance, which was at its height in England at the time of Bacon, involved a revolt against the utilitarian conception of knowledge. The Greeks had acquired a familiarity with Homer, as we do with music hall songs, because they enjoyed him, and without feeling that they were engaged in the pursuit of learning. But the men of the 16th century could not begin to understand him without first absorbing a very considerable amount of linguistic erudition. They admired the Greeks and did not wish to be shut out from their pleasures. They therefore copied them, both in reading the classics and in other less avowable ways. Learning, in the Renaissance, was part of the joie de vivre, just as much as drinking or love-making. And this was true not only of literature, but also of sterner studies. Everyone knows the story of Hobbes' first contact with Euclid. Opening the book, by chance, at the theorem of Pythagoras, he exclaimed, "By God, this is impossible," and proceeded to read the proofs backwards until, reaching the axioms, he became convinced. No one can doubt that this was for him a voluptuous moment, unsullied by the thought of the utility of geometry in measuring fields. It is true that the Renaissance found a practical use for the ancient languages in connection with theology, in that there is no absence of discovering something and inserting your theology into it. There is nowhere you can escape that. One of the earliest results of the new feeling for classical Latin was the discrediting of the forged decretals and the donation of Constantine. The inaccuracies which were discovered in the Vulgate and in the Septuagint made Greek and Hebrew a necessary part of the conversational equipment of Protestant divines. There are inaccuracies in the Vulgate and the Septuagint, right? Mostly because they are just like stolen, right? The Septuagint, being the first 5 books of the Bible, were almost certainly not written by Moses, even though in my unconventional Bible study, we went out of our way to attribute it to him in real time. It is almost certainly from at least the time of Ezekiel, probably the time of Isaiah, maybe even a little bit later. That is something that needs to be worked out in Christianity. And Judaism, for that matter. Both of them are equally wrong, in my opinion, for reasons that I have outlined in this 161 videos of me reading the Bible. That is how I came to those conclusions. The Republican maxims of Greece and Rome were invoked to justify the resistance of Puritans to the Stuarts and of Jesuits to monarchs who had thrown off allegiance to the Pope. But all of this was an effort rather than a cause, and the revival of classic learning, which had been in full swing in Italy for nearly a century before Luther. The main motive of the Renaissance was mental delight, the restoration of a certain richness and freedom in art and speculation, which had been lost while ignorance and superstition kept the mind's eye in blinkers. The Greeks, it was found, had devoted a part of their attention to matters not purely literary or artistic, such as philosophy, geometry, and astronomy. These studies, therefore, were respectable, but other sciences were more open to question. Medicine, it was true, was dignified by the name of Hippocrates and Galen, but in the intervening period it had become almost confined to Arabs and Jews, and inextricably intertwined with magic. Hence the dubious reputation of such men as Paracelsus. Chemistry was in even worse odor, and hardly became respectable until the 18th century. In this way it was brought about that knowledge of Greek and Latin, with a smattering of geometry and perhaps astronomy, came to be considered the intellectual equipment of a gentleman. The Greeks disdained the practical applications of geometry, and it was only in their decadence that they found a use for astronomy in the guise of astrology. The 16th and 17th centuries, in the main, studied mathematics with Hellenic disinterestedness, and tended to ignore the sciences which had been degraded by their connection with sorcery. A gradual change towards a wider and more practical conception of knowledge, which was going on throughout the 18th century, was suddenly accelerated at the end of that period by the French Revolution and the growth of machinery, of which the former gave a blow to gentlemanly culture, while the latter offered a new and astonishing hope for the exercise of ungentlemanly skills. Throughout the last 150 years, men have questioned more and more vigorously the value of useless knowledge, and have come increasingly to believe that the only knowledge worth having is that which is applicable to some part of the economics of the community. In countries such as France and England, which have a traditional educational system, the utilitarian view of knowledge has only partially prevailed. There are still, for example, professors of Chinese in the universities who read Chinese classics but are unacquainted with the works of Sun Yat-sen, which created modern China. Well, that kind of went away. There are still men who know ancient history insofar as it was related by authors whose style was pure. That is to say, up to Alexander in Greece and Nero in Rome, but refused to know the much more important later history because of the literary inferiority of the historians who related it. Even in France and England, however, the old tradition is dying, and in more up-to-date countries, such as Russia and the United States, it is utterly extinct. In America, for example, educational commissions point out that 1,500 words are all that most people employ in business correspondence, and therefore suggest that all others should be avoided in the school curriculum. Basic English, a British invention, goes still further and reduces the necessary vocabulary to 800 words. The conception of speech as something capable of aesthetic value is dying out, and it is coming to be thought that the sole purpose of words is to convey practical information. That is the sole purpose of words. In Russia, the pursuit of practical aims is even more wholehearted than in America. All that is taught in educational institutions is intended to serve some obvious purpose in education or government. The horror! The only escape is afforded by theology. The sacred scriptures must be studied by some in the original German, and a few professors must learn philosophy in order to defend dialectical materialism against the criticisms of bourgeoisie metaphysicians. As an orthodoxy becomes more firmly established, even this tiny loophole will be closed. The sacred scriptures are not originally German. I don't know who needs to hear that, but that is a fact. Knowledge everywhere is coming to be regarded not as a good in itself, or as a means of creating a broad and humane outlook of life in general, but as merely an ingredient in technical skill. See, I disagree with this. Now, that could be cultural differences between then and now, and I fully understand that. But that was not the effect that was brought about. We still have people using words not only wrong, but like intentionally wrong, right? We have people making up words. We have nonsense being spouted all of the time. And so I don't know that this was the case then. It absolutely could have been, because this was when the educational system was being rolled out. And if you don't know that the Department of Education, which is state control of education, is an abject failure, you have not paid attention to reading comprehension rates, or the understanding of mathematics, or functional society. You don't know anything about those if you think that the Department of Education is in any way successful. People were smarter before, or smart is the wrong word, I guess more learned before the Department of Education than they are now. This is part of the greater integration of society, which has been brought about by scientific technique and military necessity. There is more economic and political interdependence than there was in former times. That is true. And therefore, there is more social pressure to compel a man to live in a way that his neighbors think useful. That is also true. Educational establishments, except those for the very rich, or in England, such as have become invulnerable through antiquity, are not allowed to spend their money as they like, but must satisfy the state that they are serving a useful purpose by imparting skill and instilling loyalty. This is part and parcel of the same movement which has led to compulsory military service, Boy Scouts, and the organization of political parties, and the dissemination of political passion by the press. Well, we have that now, don't we? All right. The same movement which led to compulsory military service. Now, this was between World War I and World War II, I believe, and so I don't know that we had the draft in the same manner that we do now. Like, the draft was there for the Civil War, and then it kind of went away, and then it came back for the Vietnam War. In my understanding, and yes, I absolutely can be wrong in that. And so compulsory military service was a time-honored, antiquated way of thinking, right? That harkens back to serfdom when the Lord would come by and say, hey, I need some people to die for me. You, and you are drafted. Come on. That was how that began, and it has been a thing forever. Much like there is a government, regardless of whether you think there should be one or not, there always has been. Whenever three people get together, one guy is going to be in charge. That is how hierarchies work, and it is a natural thing. And so compulsory military service was always a thing up until it became not a thing. And now it is kind of not a thing again, even though we still have a technical draft. We have, for the most part, in most civilized countries, a voluntary military service. There are exceptions to that, Israel being one, where it is a compulsory military service because of the size of the state. But in most civilized places, that is not a thing. The organization of political parties, well, I mean, there were political parties and whatever, but dissemination of political passion by the press, boy, if we are not living in that for damn sure. We are starting to see the effects of that after this past election cycle in 2024. But all of mainstream media, and by mainstream media, I mean those who are on the television and you can see them broadcast over the air or even on cable networks, like 99% of them are leaning in one direction politically. And they have zero problem disseminating their political passion, most of which seems to be trying to convince people that socialism is actually a good idea, and it absolutely is not. Back to the text. We are all more aware of our fellow citizens than we used to be, more anxious, if we are virtuous, to do them good, and, in any case, to make them do us good. We do not like to think of anyone lazily enjoying life, projecting much, however refined may be the quality of his enjoyment. We feel that everybody ought to be doing something to help the great cause, whatever it may be, the more so as so many bad men are working against it and ought to be stopped. We have not leisure of mind, therefore, to acquire any knowledge except such as will help us in the fight for whatever it may happen to be that we think important. There is much to be said for the narrowly utilitarian view of education. There is not time to learn everything before beginning to make a living, and undoubtedly, useful knowledge is very useful. It has made the modern world. Without it, we should not have machines, or motor cars, or railways, or aeroplanes. It should be added that we should not have modern advertising or modern propaganda. You think propaganda was less effective because it was not modern? That is stupid. Modern knowledge has brought about an immense improvement in average health, and at the same time has discovered how to exterminate large cities by poison gas. Again, between World War I and World War II. World War I was fought largely with poison gas. Whatever is distinctive in our world, as compared with former times, has its source in useful knowledge. No community as yet has enough of it, and undoubtedly education must continue to promote it. It must also be admitted that a great deal of the traditional cultural education was foolish. Boys spend many years acquiring Latin and Greek grammar without being, at the end, either capable or desirous, except in a small percentage of cases, of reading a Greek or Latin author. Modern languages and history are preferable from every point of view to Latin and Greek. They are not only more useful, but they give much more culture in much less time. For an Italian of the 15th century, since practically everything worth reading, if not in his own language, was in Greek or Latin, these languages were indispensable keys to culture. But since that time, great literatures have grown up in various modern languages, and the development of civilization has been so rapid that knowledge of antiquity has become much less useful in understanding our problems than knowledge of modern nations and their comparatively recent history. This statement right here is one of the reasons why we have the ancient lore playlist. We talk about the Enuma Elish. We talk about Plato, Socrates, and various other historical people. If it is older than 200 years old, I add it to the ancient lore playlist. This is not. This doesn't go there. But in the ancient lore playlist, we went through the entirety of Plato's Republic, where we learned a lot of very useful things. We went through Timaeus and Critias, where we learned some deep history about the earth and things of along that nature. So there are definitely things to be extracted from history, and I'm hoping soon to return to some of those things. Now, a lot of those are translations. They have to be, because I don't speak Greek, I don't speak Latin, I can't read it, but we trust the translations, and so we read the translations here. We're trying to learn things from history, and that is one of the best ways to do it, is to go back to the parts that people don't pay attention to. Reading through Plato is very good for you, and maybe Bertrand Russell should have spent some time on that. The traditional schoolmasters, I think that the Republic should be taught in every American school. You should be reading the Republic probably around 5th grade, and again in high school. The traditional schoolmaster's point of view, which was admirable at the time of the revival of learning, became gradually unduly narrow, since it ignored what the world has done since the 15th century. And not only history and modern languages, but science also, when properly taught, contributes to culture. It is therefore possible to maintain that education should have other aims than direct utility. Why? What? That's not true. Without defending the traditional curriculum. Like, we don't have the time to teach all of history. That is an exceptionally long period of time. We do, however, try to encapsulate that into the curriculums. Now, I disagree in many ways with the Department of Education and the curriculum that they have mandated. There are great things that are left out of that. But some of it is useless, right, in the grand scope of things. And we still learn them, right? Everybody likes to use algebra, and I don't, because you use algebra in every day. But everybody says, when am I ever going to use algebra? You use it every day. You just don't realize it. But there are things like that that we teach that don't necessarily bear important relevance to where we are going forward. But I do believe that in school, for the most part, you should learn things that have direct relevance to life, and some of that does include history. All of it includes science, but history, absolutely, right? Modern languages, yes. Science, yes. I don't know that either one of those would be not having direct utility, right? History has direct utility. If you do not learn from the past, you will repeat it. And we are really close to repeating some hard lessons these days. And so I don't believe that he even fully articulated the sentence in the correct manner here. Utility and culture, when both are conceived broadly, are found to be less incompatible than they appear to the fanatical advocates of either. Apart, however, from the cases in which the culture and direct utility can be combined, there is indirect utility of various kinds in the possession of knowledge which does not contribute to technical efficiency. I think some of the worst features of the modern world could be improved by a greater encouragement of such knowledge and a less ruthless pursuit of mere professional competence. Now, I think you may have been proven wrong there. Like that is really what led to where we are in the Department of Education, right? Adding in all of this extra shit that doesn't matter. Like, science is very clear on what a male and a female is, and yet we have curriculums designed around accommodating more than those definitions. That is stupid, right? leaning into political ideologies and teaching things that are patently untrue, such as the fact that we teach carbon is a harmful element to the environment. That is patently untrue. The more carbon, the more plants, the more likely humanity is to survive. That is the truth of the situation. And yet, we have ideologies teaching the opposite, that carbon is going to cause our destruction. That is fucking stupid. And so, allowing these extra things that are not based in science into actual instruction have led to the current crisis situation that our education is under. But along the same lines, I do not believe that we should be teaching the Bible other than as history, and that with some extreme caveats. Again, see the Unconventional Bible Study. When conscious activity is wholly concentrated on some one definite purpose, the ultimate result, for most people, is lack of balance accompanied by some form of nervous disorder. The men who directed German policy during the war made mistakes, for example, as regards the submarine campaign, which brought America on to the side of the Allies, which any person coming fresh to the subject could not have seen to be unwise. This may have been after World War II. I don't know that we had submarines in World War I. I am not positive on that, but which they could not judge sanely, owing to mental concentration and lack of holidays. Wow. So you think that the people setting the German policy were not taking holidays? You think that the brass in charge of the thing were not taking leisure? Do you really believe that? Have you not? Well, you wouldn't have been able to study history at this point. The same sort of thing may be seen wherever bodies of men attempt tasks which put a prolonged strain upon spontaneous impulses. Japanese imperialists, Russian communists, and German Nazis, okay, so this is after World War II, all have a kind of tense fanaticism which comes of living too exclusively in the mental world of certain tasks to be accomplished. When the tasks are as important and as feasible as the fanatics suppose, the result may be magnificent, but in most cases, narrowness of outlook has caused oblivion of some powerful counteracting force, or has made all such forces seem the work of the devil, to be met by punishment and terror. Men, as well as children, have need of play, that is to say, periods of activity having no purpose beyond present enjoyment. We did, in praise of idleness yesterday, it is on this playlist. But if play is to serve its purpose, it must be possible to find pleasure and interest in matters not connected with work. I do believe that, but not to the extreme degree that Bertrand Russell does. The amusements of modern urban populations tend more and more to be passive and collective, and to consist of inactive observation of the skilled activities of others. Undoubtedly, such amusements are much better than none, but they are not as good as would be those of a population which had, through education, a wider range of intelligent interests not connected with work. Better economic organization, allowing mankind to benefit by the productivity of machines, should lead to a very great increase of leisure, and did. And much leisure is apt to be tedious, except to those who have considerable intelligent activities and interests. Even if they have the capacity, most of them would not use it. If a leisured population is to be happy, it must be an educated population, and must be educated with a view to mental enjoyment, as well as to the direct usefulness of technical knowledge. The cultural element in the acquisition of knowledge, when it is successfully assimilated, forms the character of a man's thoughts and desires, making them concern themselves, in part at least, with large, impersonal objects, not only with matters of immediate importance to himself. It has been too readily assumed that when a man has acquired certain capacities by means of knowledge, he will use them in ways that are socially beneficial. The narrowly utilitarian conception of education ignores the necessity of training a man's purpose as well as his skill. There is, in untrained human nature, a very considerable element of cruelty, which shows itself in many ways, great and small. Boys at school tend to be unkind to a new boy, or to one whose clothes are not quite conventional. That is hierarchical distribution in action. Many women, and not a few men, inflict as much pain as they can by means of malicious gossip. Again, hierarchy in action. It is a natural instinct in humanity to arrange ourselves in hierarchical structures. Somebody leads, somebody follows. That is the way that it works. The Spaniards enjoy bullfights. The British enjoy hunting and shooting. The same cruel impulses take more serious forms in the hunting of Jews in Germany and kulaks in Russia. Okay. All imperialism affords scope for them, and in war they become sanctified as the highest forms of public duty. Are you trying to intimate that maybe we should not have interfered in Nazi Germany? Right? They were hunting Jews. Do we not go and stop that? Was that not the highest form of public duty, to actually get in there and stop them from genociding people? I mean, we didn't do that in Russia. Hitler was killing people. Yeah, that's true. He was boxing them up and shipping them off and gassing them and burning them. That is true. But what happened in Russia in your time, right? Bertrand Russell. They were deliberately starving an entire country. The Holodomor, if you were unaware, that was a deliberate decision. They made these people grow the food and then took the food from them and let them starve. And if you had the fucking audacity to go out into the fields, which had already been harvested, and attempt to pick up some food that fell on the ground that was missed in order to feed your kid, you were killed. That was an intentional thing. We didn't go and stop that. That should have been one of the highest forms of public duty. We should have intervened in that. That would have necessitated military interaction. That would have been imperial will being imposed upon a different peoples. But it should have happened. We would not have the Holodomor where that happened, or we would not have the Road of Bones in Russia, where if you were a dissenter, what happened to you? They sent you off to the gulags, right? Everybody knows that. But what happened in the gulags? You were worked to death. And in one particular instance, which I am referencing here, they took these people from the gulag and they were in the frozen north in the middle of winter, digging a road without enough clothes on, without enough food to provide the calories that they needed to do it. And if you died, they buried you in the road because they were not going to dig a separate hole and they weren't going to waste any fuel on you. So there are literally at least thousands, but probably millions of people buried underneath a roadway in Russia. Again, a deliberate choice that we did not intervene in. Now, while it must, and that is directly related to communism, which is why I make sure to point that out. That is not even counting the Great Leap Forward. Let's talk about the Great Leap Forward. That worked so well in communism. They decided, hey, we want to grow some things. So what we're going to do, we're going to kill all of the farmers. We're going to kill all the farmers. We're going to take their things and we're going to put people out there that have never done this before. And we're going to give them instructions on how to do this, but we don't know what we're doing. So we're going to give them incorrect instructions. They were planting corn 2 feet in the ground. Like, nothing's going to come from that. They had a whole war against sparrows because they couldn't plant correctly. And they killed millions of people by those decisions. Once again, the absolute effects of communism. Now, while it must be admitted that highly educated people are sometimes cruel, sometimes, I think there can be no doubt that they are less often so than people whose minds have lain fallow. You think so? Tell that to Goebbels. Tell that to, who's somebody else? Somebody in the Nazi Party. Any of their scientists, any of them. They were all highly educated, yet they were killing people cruelly, on purpose. Look at Dr. Anthony Fauci, right? Everybody's good hero from the mess in 2020. But what did we find out about him? What was he doing to beagles? Do you remember what he was doing to beagles? Torturing them. Like literally torturing dogs for the furtherance of science. It's not often, or it's not less often so. It's just better concealed with different reasoning. And if you can't do it here, send it overseas. They'll let you do it over there. That shit happens all of the time. They are still testing radioactive effects on people. The bully in a school is seldom a boy whose proficiency in learning is up to the average. Now that is true. There are generally several factors involved in that. The most often thing that is in that is abuse at home. But ignorance does play a large part. When a lynching takes place, the ringleaders are almost invariably very ignorant men, and that again is true. This is not because mental cultivation produces positive humanitarian feelings, though it may do so. It is rather because it gives other interest in the ill treatment of neighbors and other sources of self-respect than the assertion of domination. The two things most universally desired are power and admiration. Ignorant men can, as a rule, only achieve either by brutal means involving the acquisition of physical mastery. Culture gives a man less harmful forms of power and more deserving ways of making himself admired. Galileo did more than any monarch has done to change the world, and his power immeasurably exceeded that of his persecutors. He also took somebody else's knowledge. He had therefore no need to aim at becoming a prosecutor in his turn. Perhaps the most important advantage of useless knowledge is that it promotes a contemplative habit of mind. There is in the world much too much readiness, not only for action without adequate previous reflection, but also for some sort of action on occasions on which wisdom would counsel inaction. People show their bias in this matter in various curious ways. Mephistopheles tells the young student that theory is gray, but the tree of life is green, and everyone quotes this as if it was Goethe's opinion, instead of what he supposes the devil would be likely to say to an undergraduate. Hamlet is held up as an awful warning against thought without action, but no one holds up Othello as a warning against action without thought. Professors such as Bergson, from a kind of snobbery towards the practical man, decry philosophy and say that life at its best should resemble a cavalry charge. For my part, I think action is best when it emerges from a profound apprehension of the universe and human destiny, not from some wildly passionate impulse of romantic but disproportioned self-assertion. A habit of finding pleasure in thought rather than in action is a safeguard against unwisdom and excessive love of power, a means of preserving serenity in misfortune and peace of mind among worries. A life confined to what is personal is likely, sooner or later, to become unbearably painful. It is only by windows into a larger and less fretful cosmos that the more tragic parts of life become endurable. A contemplative habit of mind has advantages ranging from the most trivial to the most profound. To begin with minor vexations, such as fleas, missing trains, or cantankerous business associates. Such troubles seem hardly worthy to be met by reflections on the excellence of heroism or the transitoriness of all human ills, and yet the irritation to which they give rise destroys many people's good temper and enjoyment of life. On such occasions there is much consolation to be found in out-of-way bits of knowledge which have some real or fancied connection with the trouble of the moment, or even if they have none, they serve to obliterate the present from one's thoughts. When assailed by people who are white with fury, it is pleasant to remember the chapter in Descartes' treatise on the passions entitled, "Why those who grow pale with rage are more to be feared than those who grow red." When one feels impatient over the difficulty of securing international cooperation, one's impatience is diminished if one happens to think of the sainted King Louis IX before embarking on his crusade, allying himself with the old man of the mountain, who appears in the Arabian Nights as the dark source of half of the wickedness in the world. When the rapacity of capitalists grows oppressive, one may be suddenly consoled by the recollection that Brutus, the exemplar of republican virtue, lent money to a city at 40% and hired a private army to besiege it when it failed to pay the interest. Why is that a consolation, right? The rapacity of capitalists is automatically biased language, right? And we know that he's a socialist, so he doesn't think correctly. But the exemplar of republican virtue, you know what republican means? It means the rule of law, right? It means that we have decided these are the actions by which commerce can commence. It is our version of the republic is we live by the Constitution. It is the defining characteristic of the country in which we, the American people, live. And that is our rule of law. Anything is kicked back to that. Now, we have various other laws, but they cannot contradict the Constitution. Personal property is part of that. If there is an agreement that I have money, you need money, I'm going to lend you money at this rate of interest, and you agree to take that money, then you are obliged to pay it back. That is what it is. That is the rule of law. That is Republican. So, yeah. That being the law, it is expected that it would be met. And if it is not met, there will be consequences to it not being met. Now, these days, if you don't pay your debt back to me, I get to seize your assets, right? I go through the court of law and I take your assets. That is how that works. Unless there is a bankruptcy filing in between where judicial decision is made to not require me to repay that debt, they get to come and take whatever was security for that debt at a minimum. That is not unreasonable. That is not something outside of the box. The man had money. He lent it to a government at an interest rate that they agreed to. And when they decided not to repay it, he went and took it back. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. You should have followed the fucking law. Curious learning not only makes unpleasant things less unpleasant, but also makes pleasant things more pleasant. I have enjoyed peaches and apricots more since I have known that they were first cultivated in China in the early days of the Han Dynasty, that Chinese hostages held by the great king Kansaka introduced them into India, whence they spread to Persia, reaching the Russian Empire in the 1st century of our era, that the word apricot is derived from the same Latin source as the word precocious, because the apricot ripens early, and that the A at the beginning was added by mistake, owing to a false etymology. All of this makes the fruit taste much sweeter. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It tastes exactly the same as it would if you did not have that knowledge. Your conception of it is a little bit sweeter, but we've already determined that you do not think exactly correctly, right? This is virtue signaling in the nth degree, though, right? This is, I am a better person, and my food tastes better because I know this thing that you do not know. And that is wild. About 100 years ago, a number of well-meaning philanthropists started societies for the diffusion of useful knowledge, with the result that people have ceased to appreciate the delicious savor of useless knowledge. Now, I don't believe that there really is a whole lot of useless knowledge, right? There are useless suppositions. That is not even knowledge, right? Assuming that someone can change their gender, completely useless. It has no real bearing in reality whatsoever. So that is a supposition that you are making, and it is not even knowledge. If it is true knowledge, then it is true, and all knowledge is useful, even if it is irrelevant to the current situation. That does not mean that it is useless. It just means that you are not at the point of use. Opening Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy at haphazard on a day when I was threatened by that mood. Yeah, imagine that. I mean, if you were unaware, he was quite often afflicted by melancholy. He was definitely victim mentality personified. I learned that there is a melancholy matter, but that, while some think it may be engendered of all four humors, Galen holds that it may be engendered of three alone, excluding phlegm or pituita, whose true assertion Valerius and Mandatus stiffly maintain, and so doth Fuchsius, Montaltus, and Montanus. How, say they, can white become black? In spite of this unanswerable argument, Hercules de Saxonia and Cardan, Guianerius and Laurentius are, so Burton tells us, of the opposite opinion. So, by these historical reflections, my melancholy, whether due to three humors or to four, was dissipated. And it had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. As a cure for too much zeal, I can imagine few measures more effective than a course of such ancient controversies. But while the trivial pleasures of culture have their place as a relief from the trivial worries of practical life, the more important merits of contemplation are in relation to the greater evils of life. Death and pain and cruelty, and the blind march of nations into unnecessary disaster. For those to whom dogmatic religion can no longer bring comfort, there is a need of some substitute. If life is not to become dusty and harsh and filled with trivial self-assertion. The world, at present, is full of angry self-centered groups, each incapable of viewing human life as a whole, each willing to destroy civilization rather than yield an inch. To this narrowness, no amount of technical instruction will provide an antidote. The antidote, insofar as it is a matter of individual psychology, is to be found in history, biology, astronomy, and all those studies which, without destroying self-respect, enable the individual to see himself in his proper perspective. See the Infinite Integrations playlist. What is needed is not this on that specific piece of information, but such knowledge as inspires a conception of the ends of human life as a whole. Art and history, acquaintance with the lives of heroic individuals, and some understanding of the strangely accidental and ephemeral position of man in the cosmos. All this touched with an emotion of pride in what is distinctively human, the power to see and to know, to feel magnanimously, and to think with understanding. It is from large perceptions combined with impersonal emotion that wisdom most readily springs. Life, at all times full of pain, is more painful in our time than in the 2 centuries that preceded it. Bullshit. The attempt to escape pain drives men to triviality, to self-deception, to the invention of vast collective myths. Right? You cannot tell me that the centuries prior to anesthesia was less painful. The centuries before we learned to dull pain, before we cut off an arm, right? Before we understood traumatic stress syndromes, before we understood a variety of things, right? When most people's children died, this right after World War II was when we started being able to keep children alive, right? For any measurable distance. We can do that now. Most people's children don't die. Back in before this, with the times he is talking about, the 2 centuries prior to it, people had 8 kids because 5 of them was probably going to die. That is a reality. But these momentary alleviations do but increase the sources of suffering in the long run. Both private and public misfortune can only be mastered by a process in which will and intelligence interact. See the Infinite Integrations playlist or the Esoterica playlist for more on how to do that. That is literally what I do, is help with that. The part of will is to refuse to shirk the evil or accept an unrealistic solution, while the part of intelligence is to understand it, to find a cure if it is curable, and if not, to make it bearable by seeing it in its relations, accepting it as unavoidable, and remembering what lies outside it in other regions, other ages, and the abysses of interstellar space. All right, so that is going to bring us to the end of the study of useless knowledge. And once again, right, I don't have as much to say to this one because in part I agree with him and I don't argue the parts that I agree with. I will point them out on occasion, but for the most part, I don't try to override or talk about things that are being explained as we go along. There is useless knowledge, but I don't know that he had the correct definition for that. Right. I am a fount of useless knowledge. There are all kinds of minutiae that I can pull out about all kinds of situations that have no bearing in reality whatsoever. That is useless knowledge. Useless knowledge is promulgated often in our society. It is not something vague or whatever. Like, it is everywhere. But for the most part, even useless knowledge serves a purpose at some point in your life, even if it is merely teaching you how to think about something, whether you are succumbing to what you're being presented, or if you can go dialectic and say A and B are things, which one is a true thing? Right? That is logical processes. Yes, no, check yes, check no. That is how we think and we move and we deduce new information. So anything that contributes to that is not necessarily useless. Could we learn more useful things? Absolutely. And every single piece of useful information is not destroying idleness. It is not taking away from learning poetry and prose. Those are still useful. Right? Leisure is a useful activity. It just shouldn't be abused in the way that he wants it to be. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I didn't have a whole lot to add to this one other than what I pointed out. And so, if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was said today. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me do in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the comments as well. If you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks, because the bills do not pay themselves. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.